Hello, fellow investors. Welcome to the Financial Podcast. It's me, Lucas,
And me, Marcus.
two regular guys talking about investment for regular people. And on today's episode, we're going to cover what is an index fund.
Yeah, we're gonna basically cover most of it to the extent of our knowledge, like what they are based on, should you invest into them, who are they for. We're gonna touch on each of these points a little bit.
Yeah, so we have 5 major points. First, index funds, basically, what are they?
Yeah.
Second, what different types of index funds are there? What index funds are there? Then number 3, who can invest in index funds? 4, are index funds the best way to invest your money? And number 5, how do you invest in index funds? And in relation to that also, I'm going to talk a little bit about Nordnet, which is how I personally invest in index funds at the moment.
Yeah. And Lucas definitely have more experience in this area than I do.
Yeah. So if you want to take it away, Marcus, and tell us a bit what an index fund actually is.
To explain what an index fund is, I think it's prudent to start with what is an index in itself, because the funds we're talking about, they are based upon indexes. So an index is basically that you take a bunch of companies that somehow kind of belong together. An example would be the S&P 500 in the US, which is probably the most famous index along with maybe Nasdaq.
And what is the S&P 500?
The S&P 500 is the Standard & Poor's index for 500 companies, and these are generally thought to be the 500 publicly traded biggest companies in the US right now. Companies in these indexes are then assigned points based on how they are performing, and the total amount of points that these companies have accrued, it's the benchmark for the whole market. So you can see how are all these companies performing, and generally this is used to gauge how the economy of these particular companies, which are generally really big companies in a country, how are they doing. We also have indexes in Finland and Sweden and the Nordics. I know it's the OMX in both Helsinki, and it should be in Stockholm also, if I'm not mistaken. And these are indexes that tracks the biggest companies in either Finland or Sweden. And these are also divided into parts, so you have the OMX 25, which is the 25 biggest companies in Finland. They get a particular number, how they are performing, and these points are constantly changing depending on how the companies in this index are performing. And some companies might be doing really well in this index, naturally. Some might be doing very poorly. So the index total is dependent on which are doing very good. They might be holding up the points of this index. We actually touched upon this in a prior video when we talked about why the stock market is still going up even though the economy is kind of tanking. If you want an explanation on how the indexes works in this regard, you can check that video. The funds that are based upon these indexes are basically funds that invest solely into the companies that are involved in these index. And now that I have briefly explained how the index works, what they are based on, how the companies are selected for each index, usually it's you bunch companies together that are of similar size, sectors like a technology index. There are those in US, there are industrial indexes. So this is basically what they are based upon, and the companies are then grouped into these indexes, and then there are funds that revolve around them, and I think Lucas can tell us more about that.
So basically, to summarize what Marcus said, an index fund is going to be a portfolio of stocks or bonds, and these are designed to mimic the composition and performance of a financial market index. Again, an index that Marcus talked about.
So you have, if I can just briefly cut in, you have like the technology sector. You can buy a share of the funds in that technology sector, so that you get a piece of every company involved into that sector, so to speak.
Yeah, and these pieces are a good way to think of it, because if you think of the entire sector as a big pie, then an index fund is a really small pie baked in a way that it looks as close to identical as the big pie. And then instead of trying to buy like small pieces of all of different places in the pie, in the big pie, you can just buy the entire really small pie, and that would then be the index fund.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
I think so.
So you have a big pie and you have a really small pie who's baked in the exact same way as the really big pie, and then you can buy the small pie.
Yeah, or pieces
instead of trying.
Yeah, pieces.
Yeah.
Of it.
So what this leads to, of course, the positive thing with this is that it gets really diversified.
I think that's probably the main point of an index fund, is to get a fund that is as diversified as possible.
So let's continue to our second point, which is what index funds are there. As we covered to some extent, there's basically every kind of index fund that you can imagine out there. Currently, for me, I've invested through Nordnet, we'll talk about that more later, in a bunch of different ones, already trying this system out. And I have an index that's focusing on long-term bonds in the US. So it basically mimics the overall long-term bond market in the US. I have one for what we talked about, the OMX 25, I think it's in Helsinki. So there's basically, for every sector you can think of,
There's
almost.
an index fund. I can just briefly touch upon that. I actually do have a fund which could be considered an index fund. It's an index fund that tracks the African financial market, actually. Currently, it's not doing, though, too well, but I think it's mainly due to Corona.
Yeah, I think that's long term, I think that's going to be a great investment. So anyway, let's also quickly mention who can invest in index funds. And the short answer is basically anyone. Similar to point 2, basically everything. All kinds of index funds, and basically anyone can invest in them.
Yeah, I'd say a little caveat is that, of course, some might be protected somehow, and sometimes they do have a minimal amount that you have to invest, like 100 euros or something like that, $100, I guess, comparable. But we could just briefly mention, because we are no experts on this, but of course, if you have access to Acorn or Robinhood or something like this, they are really great options to keep your index
so
funds.
You have a lot of options there. And also, if you live in the Nordic countries, for example, again, Nordnet, 15 euros is basically always the minimum for all of the index funds that I've researched and seen so far, at least. So 15 euros have been the minimum that you have to contribute. So it's really available.
Yeah, that's really good, actually, because I was speaking out of experience with Degiro, and on Degiro it's 100 euros.
So I think, for example,
amount.
if you're a student and you don't have much money lying around, Nordnet has really made it easy to get started in that way.
Yeah, they might definitely have different strengths. That like Nordnet is more for index funds and things like this, while Degiro puts more emphasis on stocks.
Buying stocks, because then when it comes to index funds, I really... So far, I've been really happy with how they handle things, and I'll talk a little bit more about what the things you can do just shortly, and we'll do an upcoming video near future just solely focused on Nordnet and what you can do there, but I'll summarize some of the things from that video already here.
Yeah,
but
maybe we could go over to point 4, because I think it's really relevant to this point. Are index funds the best way to invest your money? I think that's really a poignant question. A lot of people actually have said that index funds is, like Warren Buffett, for instance, has said that it's probably the best way to invest for most people. I'd say that this is by far the best way if you are not at all interested in managing money and stocks and the finance in general. If you just want to invest in something that is relatively reliable and you want to perhaps earn some money for your retirement, bigger purchases in the future, index funds might definitely be a way to go for you, from my experience and what I've heard, because in general, it's a really great way to make an investment in a portfolio that is already very diversified. It's probably not going to tank completely. Like I said, we have made a video that explains the question why the stock market and in tandem index funds, why they are still going up even though the rest of the economy is doing poorly.
But another thing why it's good, what you talked about earlier, why it's such a good option for people who want to take a more passive approach, is the fact, of course, that it matches the overall market, and it's not something you have to manage. You don't have to try to time anything. You shouldn't even try to time anything.
No. It moves naturally.
It moves naturally, and the best way, for example, according to Warren Buffett, to invest in index funds are through time averaged investment, which is basically that you decide an amount that you're going to invest each month, for example, and then you just keep doing that. Doesn't matter what happens on the outside. You keep investing that amount until you reach your goal. That's the idea. Because then, if things are going up, you're gonna take part in that, and then if things go down, you're gonna also buy when things are going down. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry, but I just want to add this. Usually you can buy when things are going poorly, you can usually get a larger chunk out of the index fund for the same amount that you're paying normally. So if you're paying 50 euros for your index share in the index fund, that's the monthly amount you have set in, you're actually going to get more when times are poor, because it's like a stock that it will go up. The price might increase and you get less of the fund. Times are good. So actually investing in index funds when times are bad is not necessarily a bad idea, because you will get more out of the fund, and these shares of the fund that you have accrued in bad times will be worth more once times
later on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And again, returning to this passive nature of the index fund, this also means that the people who are managing the index fund, the fees are almost always a lot lower. But this is something you really need to research. What are the fees? If they're more than 1%, I would choose something else usually as a general rule of thumb, because since we're talking about investments that you're going to buy and you're going to hold them, meaning we're talking about compound interest over time, any things that eat into this interest is going to have a big effect later on. So like if the percent, we've talked about this before, I know, but it's so important, like, to try to keep your fees as small as possible.
Especially like percentual fees, because they are going to go up as you earn more from your investments.
Yeah, so this is something that can potentially save you, like, throughout your lifetime, hundreds of thousands, depending on how much you invest. So this is like a really important point, and this is almost like the main positive aspect of it. It's basically three things. It's how diversified it is, how low the fees are, and the fact that it's so difficult in the case of, for example, mutual funds to do a better job with trying to actively time the market.
Yeah.
Because as we said, you shouldn't try to time the market, especially if you don't know what you're doing. So that brings us on to the fifth point. How do you invest in index funds? And there are a lot of different ways to do this, of course, depending on if you live in the States or if you live in Europe or if you live in Asia. Sorry, if we have anyone watching in Asia, can't really help you. I don't know. I'm not familiar with what you have going on there, but or you can find it on the internet. US have a lot of different options, like even really simple ones, like apps like Acorn and Robinhood,
for instance. I think those are probably the biggest ones. Robinhood is probably the biggest one.
Yeah, we're not going to talk too much about them because they're not available to us here in Europe and here in Finland. But what we have in the Nordic countries is we have a few different options, not that much. But Nordnet, when it comes to index funds, is actually really good. That's what I personally use.
Yeah.
I know I've already talked some about it in this video, but I'll just briefly summarize what you can do with it. Decide a payment that you're going to pay each month, and then on Nordnet you can basically set it and forget it, so that it automatically invests the money you pay it each month for you into, for example, an index fund or several index funds. Like for me, I'm trying to follow the all-weather portfolio, so then I have a few different buckets where I put the money in specific percentages. I won't go into that now, but so these are some of the options you have with Nordnet, which is why I think it's really good with index funds.
Just briefly, I'm using Degiro. It's available in the whole of Europe. So even if you're in the UK, you're in the Netherlands, you're in France, you're in Italy, wherever, you can use Degiro. I don't think it's available in the States though. I think it's pretty good in general, but I think it's more for actually picking stocks. You can definitely buy funds in there, index funds and ETFs, things like this. If you are a beginning investor, I'm not sure I would recommend it, because you have to put in a minimal amount of 100 euros, I think. But I would agree with Lucas that Nordnet does sound like it's the best alternative for sure if you are in Finland to invest into index funds, unless you can go through a private broker somehow.
But this has been really long, as usual. Let's recap quickly. Today we've talked about what is an index fund, what they are, what kind of different index funds are there, and who can invest in index funds. Then, are index funds the best way to invest your money? And finally, how do you invest in index funds? These are the things we've covered.
A few platforms where you can invest. I'd also like to add one thought here at the end. I think that maybe in the future we might do a new version of this video, because right now we're just getting into investing. We don't know a lot. This is just what we have researched at this point. In the future, we might actually post an updated version where we have invested more, we have seen more return. This was more like a presentation of what an index fund is. And in the future, maybe we can do a tips and tricks video of index funds, what you could consider and things like this. Because at this point, we are very much beginners when it comes to investing, and for sure index funds and funds in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is going to be the case with a lot of these, that as usual, this is a journey for us, and we're learning alongside you. So please keep that in mind. And as we always recommend, Google everything, research everything before you make any decisions. So as always, thank you so much for listening. If you found anything useful, please hit the like button and subscribe and all that good stuff, and leave comments. We always answer comments.
All support is really appreciated, and all advice for that matter also. We are beginners, so if you have any tips on which funds to buy, or if you recommend something different than index funds, feel free to share.
Yeah, and if you want to go ahead and fact check us, just leave it in the comments and we'll get right on that. Okay, so thank you. See you next week.
See you.